The Pacific Ocean is the world's largest physical feature, so large that it dwarfs all others. It's bigger than the Atlantic, the Indian and the Arctic Oceans combined. Bigger than Europe and Asia. From its eastern to its western shores, it extends halfway round the globe. So the discovery and settlement of the widely scattered islands of the Pacific across thousands of kilometres of open ocean, without charts or navigation instruments, was an achievement quite unprecedented in human history. At a time when people elsewhere in the world had rarely been out of sight of land, the boat-building craft, seamanship and sheer audacity that peopled the Pacific Islands seems almost incredible. After all the great migrations and colonisations had settled the entire Pacific Rim, from Tasmania all the way around to Terra del Fuego, only one blank remained. And that was the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean itself, sprinkled with its thousands of tiny atolls and islands. But even this huge area was finally settled too by a combination of human curiosity and remarkable seagoing skills. That last expansion began down here, in the islands of Southeast Asia. The earliest sea journeys around the edges of the Pacific began more than 50,000 years ago. From the Asian mainland into the islands of Indonesia and the Philippines, then on to New Guinea and Australia. By 30,000 years ago, the Melanesian people were moving out of their heartland in New Guinea into the Pacific as far as the Solomons. How these first crossings of the open ocean were made, we can only guess at. But whatever craft the people used to venture into the Pacific, with its storms and mighty swells, they founded a maritime tradition that has not been equalled anywhere. As we saw at the beginning of this series, those first watercraft might have been something as simple as the bamboo rafts, perhaps with a sail, that fishermen still use along the coast of China. In many parts of Indonesia and New Guinea, where large forest trees are plentiful, rafts gave way to dugout canoes, cut from a single log. Dugouts are solid craft and last a long time, but they're not very stable. They're suitable only for rivers, lakes, or calm inshore waters. Throughout island Southeast Asia, the instability of the dugout was overcome by the addition of outriggers, one of Asia's great maritime inventions. These prevented the hull from tipping either way. For thousands of years, and still today in the sheltered waters of island Southeast Asia, double outriggers have been basic transport for fishing, travelling and carrying cargo. But further east, on the open seas of the Pacific, when the adventurous Melanesians began to expand their island world, the double outriggers created a problem. If a loaded canoe straddled a trough between two large wave crests, the weight of the unsupported hull could break the outriggers off. The Melanesian answer was beautifully simple. They removed one outrigger.
Now the hull with a single stronger outrigger could ride the largest waves, with both resting on the surface. These canoes are sailed with the outrigger on the windward side, where its weight counterbalances the pressure of the wind on the sail. Lashed to its flexible mounting with coconut fibre rope and springy palm struts, this ingenious device acts like a shock absorber while slicing through the seas with little resistance. A further Melanesian improvement was to build up the sides of the dugout with planks to make a deeper and more seaworthy hull. With these developments of hull and outrigger, as well as improvements to sails and steering, the Melanesians became great boat builders and seamen, the world's first true deep-water sailors. As their skills and confidence grew, they began to make longer voyages across wider water gaps. With sufficient food on board, they could now stay at sea for many days, even weeks. Traditional life around the fireplace continues at sea. Dried sago is broken up. Coconut halves are grated. The sago coconut mix provides the carbohydrate, and for protein, there is always fish. With this new mobility, Melanesia slowly expanded into the Pacific. Some people were always on the move, like gypsies. These villages in Pere, on Manus, have remained virtual transients. Driven from their original home by wars or overpopulation, they arrived here a few hundred years ago. The original inhabitants would give them no land where they could grow taro or collect sago, so the Pere people are confined to the foreshore. Groups like this get most of their food from the sea. In the shallow lagoons inside the fringing coral reef, they still use an old technique for fishing that goes back to the sheltered coastal waters of Southeast Asia. At low tide in the lagoon, the men put out palm leaf curtains to make a large enclosure. Then they slowly close the circle to drive stray fish into the centre where they can be netted. But this method of harvesting has its limits, as the area must be rested until fish move back into it. But the evolution of the ocean-going outrigger canoe opened up a completely new resource, the wide-ranging fish of the open oceans, bonito, barracuda and tuna. To go after bigger fish, the islanders first used their traditional herding technique to catch bait fish in a lagoon. These small fish form dense shoals, casting a dark shadow on the lagoon floor. They make little attempt to escape as the ring closes in on them. With baskets full of live bait, the real fishing can begin, outside the reef. The flash of small fish near the surface and the gleam of pearl shell hooks are irresistible to the hungry tuna. Access to this rich resource, the growth of trade in obsidian, pottery and stone axes, the settlement of these islands in the first place, all came about through advances in canoes and skills in sailing. To see these speedy vessels skimming the ocean is almost to see Pacific history.
The obsidian trade certainly covered vast distances, from Low Island here all the way out to the Solomons, more than 2,000 kilometres out into the Pacific. This is just one indication of the extraordinary trading networks and maritime skills of the Melanesian people. But still further out, there were other large islands waiting to be settled.
Although the Melanesians were the true maritime pioneers in the Pacific, another extraordinary human movement out of Southeast Asia was about to overtake them.
This is the west coast of New Caledonia, and this particular spot is called Lapita. 30 years ago, a group of archaeologists found fragments of broken pottery eroding out of the sand dune on the edge of the beach here. And as you can see, there's still lots of it lying around. Since then, the same pottery has been found on many Melanesian islands, and it's the oldest pottery that's been found in Melanesia. It starts about 3,500 years ago. The designs on the pottery are very distinctive, and it's always, from the very beginning, very well made. And all this suggests that about 3,500 years ago, a new people with a new culture that's now called the Lapita culture came into this area from much further west, probably the Philippines or eastern Indonesia. These new people spread eastward past New Guinea very quickly, and they were probably the first people to settle Vanuatu, the New Hebrides, north of here, this island, New Caledonia, and Fiji to the east. It's very hard now to recognise their descendants in this area because there was a lot of mixing of the Lapita people and the Melanesian people. But further east, their descendants are very easy to recognise because they're the people that we now call the Polynesians.
The pottery tradition the Lapita people brought with them clearly played an important role in their culture. The early pots carried complex, often beautiful designs. Sometimes there are faces, the closest we can get to what the Lapita people looked like. But as they moved further east and time passed, their pottery declined. The designs became simpler and eventually disappeared. In the end, Lapita pottery just died out.
The Lapita people continued east, beyond New Caledonia, past Fiji, and reached Tonga by about 3,000 years ago and Samoa a little later. By now, they'd left the Melanesians behind and were well and truly on their own. Over the next 1,000 years or so, a recognisably Polynesian culture developed before the next great push eastward.
This is the village of Lapuii in Western Samoa. The Samoans and the people of Tonga to the south both show their Asian biological or physical ancestry very clearly. Most of them have the Asian eye fold, light skins, and clear blood genetic markers. Some people here are a little darker and have curly hair, a sign that there was some admixture with Melanesian people as they moved out into the Pacific, and over the 3,000 years of intermittent contact that these people have had with Melanesians since then.
The first Polynesians continued to depend on many of the foods that had been domesticated in Southeast Asia. There were three animals: the pig, the dog, and the chicken, and a number of plants: breadfruit, coconuts, bananas, and sugarcane. They also had the Asian paper mulberry tree, whose bark was beaten and dyed to make tapa cloth. And there were other links with their Asian heritage.
With the Polynesian islands just a lot of little dots on the vastness of the Pacific, it's not surprising that we normally think of the maritime skills of the Polynesians. Their canoes, fishing, navigation and migration. These skills were real enough, but the Polynesians were also farmers. One of the most important plants they brought with them from Asia was taro, and they planted it just about everywhere that it would grow. Taro likes water, and although it can be planted on dry ground, it was mostly planted in swamps and terraced irrigated fields, a system of intensive cultivation that supported very large populations in some places.
In fact, the settlement of much of the Pacific, certainly the islands of Polynesia, depended on introduced Asian food plants and animals. But as we shall see, the growing of plants and the raising of animals was to have a profound impact on the untouched islands of the Pacific.
By 2,000 years ago, around the time of Christ, the Polynesians had reached Tahiti, the Society Islands, and the Marquesas to the northeast. And it was from this base that they were to make their most adventurous open sea voyages.
In the Society Islands, the Polynesians found groups of high, dramatically weathered volcanic islands, clothed in dense vegetation. The rich volcanic soil was ideal for growing crops and produced high yields of many food plants, especially breadfruit. Some of the chiefs in the top stratum of society lived and worked in grand houses, beautifully constructed from local timber and coconut fibre lashings. Large stone ceremonial platforms were built on these islands, on the hillsides and along the coast. Some were massive, up to 3 metres high, containing enormous quantities of stone. Here the Polynesians began to carve human figures in stone, where before they'd been made of wood. Among the ceremonies practiced here, some were rather grim, even human sacrifice. In this part of Polynesia, the Pacific canoe reached its most elaborate and sophisticated form. Instead of the Melanesian canoe and outrigger, the Polynesians joined two canoes together, making a much larger and stronger vessel. Some were carved and decorated war canoes. Carrying dozens of warriors and directed by priests, these canoes lacked sails and were paddled into battle. But the sailing double canoes retained all the seaworthiness that had brought the Polynesians this far. And now they began to set off on the greatest adventures of all, over the empty horizon to the north. We'll never know what prompted these extraordinary voyages into the unknown. But they were clearly not just whims or casual adventures. Only something as imperative as the need to escape from warfare or famine, perhaps even volcanic eruptions, made the Polynesians search for a new home. The expeditions were no doubt well planned. Food, water, and everything needed for survival was packed into the great hull. They sailed by the sun and the stars, reading the waves and ocean currents to maintain direction. Untold numbers of voyages must have ended in tragedy, in storms, or when the water ran out. But some sailed on. The first sight of the islands of Hawaii must have been an extraordinary experience for the voyagers who had sailed north from the Marquesas or Tahiti more than 4,500 kilometres away. Here was a whole string of uninhabited islands rising steeply from the depths. Some were still growing, with volcanoes disgorging vast sheets of molten lava that flowed down to the sea. The first settlements in the Hawaiian Islands were made some time before 500 AD. As people made their mark here, they began to create a new kind of Polynesian society. On the coast of the big island of Hawaii stands the so-called City of Refuge. Here a huge wall cut across the neck of a peninsula, creating a sanctuary. Those who were defeated in warfare or who broke the sacred laws could seek protection here. They were looked after by the priests until they had served their time and could then go outside again without risk of attack or punishment. There were temples inside the walls, set on stone platforms. The priests lived in small fenced areas where they kept symbols of the gods and the bones of dead chiefs. All these activities were extensions of the Polynesian cultural traditions that the Hawaiians had brought with them. But in one area they went much further than any other Polynesian society had ever done. On several islands, the Polynesian settlers began to clear large areas of natural forest to grow crops in the rich volcanic soils. They piled any loose rocks up as walls. These walls marked particular fields and groups of fields. This was dry land farming on the higher slopes of old volcanoes, relying on rainfall for the necessary water. The walls were good windbreaks too, cutting down any moisture loss. In these fields they grew sweet potato and taro, as well as sugarcane, breadfruit and bananas. On the west side of Hawaii, these fields cover hundreds of square kilometres. This horticultural system was abandoned more than 100 years ago and became grasslands, used now to graze horses and cattle. But the patterns of rock walls and village compounds still show how these field systems were able to support such a large Hawaiian population.
In the first 1,500 years that people lived here, there were a great many changes to these islands. Much of the original forest was cleared and there was massive erosion. The valley slopes were terraced and irrigated for agriculture. And around the coast, many of the reef flats were turned into fish ponds. Dozens of different bird species became extinct and important new plants and animals were introduced here. These changes were dramatic enough, but so were the changes to Hawaiian society itself. The original settlers were probably very closely related, owned the land together, and were led by a chief who was descended from a common ancestor. But 1,500 years later, all that had gone, and the 250,000 Hawaiians were now clearly separated into two very distinct social classes: the chiefs, who owned all the land, and the commoners who worked it. Even the chiefs were very carefully ranked. When Captain Cook arrived here in 1779, he was impressed by one of the chiefs, a young man called Kamehameha. Soon after Cook's death, this Kamehameha began the final change to Hawaiian society. By 1810, he'd conquered all the islands in the Hawaiian chain and made himself the King of Hawaii.
That kingdom has long gone now, but Kamehameha's home is still preserved, a reminder of the remarkable society that developed here.
Whatever the pressures that built up in places like Tahiti that prompted the great open ocean voyages of discovery to islands as distant as Hawaii, they must have been repeated many times. Canoes headed off in all directions, and we'll never know what happened to most of them. But one very lucky group of voyagers we do know about. They headed off southeast into an almost empty patch of ocean.
The Polynesians who found this island were very lucky indeed. It's not very big, and it's almost 2,000 kilometres to the nearest other island. When they came ashore, they had many things with them that they'd brought from their homeland in eastern Polynesia. Yams and taro, bananas and sugarcane, even the tree for making tapa cloth. They had chickens as well, but the dogs and pigs either didn't survive the voyage or died out on the island. Once they settled in, they began to build the traditional ceremonial platforms. And then they added something that set them apart from all the other Polynesian people.
The carving of stone statues was an idea that the Polynesian settlers brought with them. But on Easter Island, the production of these figures, the moai, became an obsession. What resulted was a powerful and unique art form. The early statues are small and naturalistic, with lifelike faces and rounded bodies, just like those in Tahiti. But with time, they take on their stylized form. They grow larger, with big eyes set in a longer face. Their ears get longer. Then they have cylinders of dark red stone placed on their heads. There are nearly 1,000 statues on the island, most of them quarried from the flanks of the volcano Ranu Raraku. The volcanic stone is soft and easily chipped, and hundreds of statues were carved out along the steep outer slope. Some were made on the inner slope, looking out over the crater lake. The figures were cut lying on their back until they were attached only by a ridge of rock along their spine. Then they were detached and slid down the slope, restrained by ropes on ramps of earth. At the bottom, they were stood up and finished. Later, they were moved, perhaps on large wooden sleds, to the temple platforms and erected in groups. Some were moved as much as 10 kilometres. There were many failures. A block that broke along an unseen crack or toppled over while being finished. So there are statues here in every stage of manufacture. The largest statue known, only partly finished, lies staring skyward near the top of the slope. He's nearly 22 metres tall and weighs well over 250 tonnes. We can only guess how the Easter Islanders, with technology limited to wooden levers and grass ropes, could possibly have moved and erected a colossus like this. Easter Island is a triangle only 20 kilometres long. The many volcanic cones stand above everything. When the first colonists arrived, the island was covered with forest. They began to clear patches to grow their crops of taro and yams. As the population grew, more people became involved in carving statues. More land was cleared. Before long, it was virtually bare. Today, it's dry and brown, and among the few damp green places are the swampy lakes in the deeper craters. On the ridge that separates the crater from the ocean, there's a sacred site. There are stone houses with narrow doorways and earthen roofs. Nearby are eerie carvings on the rocks. Strange figures, half human, half bird, perhaps creator spirits. Every year, the chiefs sent their servants to swim out to the rock called Motunui to wait for the seabirds to come to nest. The first to find an egg signalled his master, who then went into seclusion out of respect for the Creator. And yet the Easter Islanders had already challenged the Creator of their island. Their forest clearance for crops, houses, and wooden sleds for moving statues had stripped the island. Winds dried the soil and erosion began. The population, perhaps 15,000, was too large. Famine, still depicted in local wooden carvings, struck the island. Warfare broke out. The chief weapons were spears tipped with obsidian, the volcanic glass that's found all over the island. Because of the warfare, statue building was abandoned. Then opposing groups began toppling over each other's statues in a savage orgy. Not one was left upright. The few standing today have been re-erected by archaeologists. All this took place only a few years before a Dutch navigator, Roggeveen, sighted this island in 1722 and named it after that auspicious day, Easter Sunday. By then, much of the past had become a mystery, even to those islanders who were left.
It's really not surprising that Easter Island generates so many stories and myths. We can forget about most of them, like visitors from outer space building the statues. But there is this suggestion that somehow South America is involved, largely because of the ideas of Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer who made that remarkable and really very courageous voyage in his raft, the Kon-Tiki, drifting from South America into Polynesia because he believed that these islands were originally settled from South America. As we've seen, Easter Island, like all of Polynesia, was settled from the west. So as far as that's concerned, Heyerdahl was wrong. But these islanders did grow the sweet potato, a plant that was domesticated in South America. There was a South American palm here as well. And then there are things like this, a stone wall with the blocks cut exactly like the Inca walls in the Andes. So it does seem there was some limited contact with South America. We don't know whether islanders went to South America and came back, or whether some South Americans were blown off course and ended up on Easter Island. But that was long after the original Polynesian settlers reached this island, tucked away in this most remote corner of the Pacific. Those founding voyages of the early Polynesians across huge expansions of open ocean to Hawaii and Easter Island were remarkable achievements. How they did it, what their canoes were like, is a fascinating question, especially when you realise that those voyages were made nearly 2,000 years ago. We can look at the modern canoes that were used in Easter Island and Hawaii and make some intelligent guesses about what the ancestral canoes were like. But we can't hope to see real ones because they were made of wood and rope, perishable things that rot very quickly, especially in the tropics. But just occasionally, you can get lucky. This is the Bali High Hotel on Huahine Island, just north of Tahiti. When they were digging the foundations for this hotel about 10 years ago, workmen just over there found something that archaeologists normally only dream about.
Dr. Yossi Shinoto from the Bishop Museum in Hawaii was working on the island at the time and recognised some objects turned up by the workmen as Polynesian tools. He arranged to excavate the site and the hotel manager held up construction. The area was waterlogged and this preserved a remarkable collection of artefacts from a prehistoric village, which seems to have been buried by a massive hurricane and tidal wave about 1,000 years ago. The finds, which included stone adzes, complete with their handles, showed that this was a workshop for building voyaging canoes. There was a mast, a steering oar, and most significantly, long planks for building up the sides of the hull. Many of the pieces are held in the National Museum of Tahiti in Papeete, kept in fluid until permanent preservation can be carried out. The ridges on the wooden tapa cloth beater are as sharp as when they were last used.
So that's really whacked down. Right.
The adze marks can still be seen on the 1,000-year-old steering oar.
It's a curious instrument.
But as well as providing the first real evidence of the existence of ancient voyaging canoes, these finds included 2 examples of something which archaeologists have been hoping to find somewhere in the eastern Pacific. These are wooden patus, stabbing weapons that until now have been found only in one isolated Polynesian society,
Under the ribs.
far from Tahiti.
Very sharp edge on it. And a real cutting instrument.
Their discovery has helped to confirm the fit of the last piece in the Polynesian jigsaw.
Very sharp. With the settlement of Hawaii and Easter Island, the Polynesians had demonstrated an amazing capacity to move around vast spaces of open ocean. But there was still one major group of islands they had yet to discover, bigger in area than all the rest of Polynesia put together. It wasn't until about 1,000 years ago that they finally reached the land of the long white cloud.
It has always seemed likely that the Maoris of New Zealand, like the Hawaiians and the Easter Islanders, came from the central Polynesian area around Tahiti. When the first Europeans found New Zealand, the Maoris were wearing tattoos and using decorated canoes very like those in Tahiti. And they used the patu, which it now seems they brought with them. And they also brought other Polynesian ways.
One of the enduring images that we all have of the Polynesians is a bit like a Paul Gauguin painting. Beautiful people living an idyllic life in some sort of lush, untouched tropical paradise. It's a nice idea, but it just isn't true. We've already seen how the Hawaiians irrevocably changed their islands to feed a growing population, and on Easter Island, logging and land clearance produced an environmental disaster. Here in New Zealand, the coolest and wettest part of Polynesia, the Maoris transformed much of the North and South Island, and they did it in only a few hundred years. They cleared large areas of forest to grow taro and sweet potato, and they set fire to the bush to encourage the growth of bracken fern, which has an edible root. And this caused pollution in the rivers and along the coast. They introduced pests like rats. Whole colonies of breeding seals were wiped out, especially in the North Island. Something like 36 species of birds became extinct, including a dozen different forms of the moa. And some of these moa, of course, were gigantic birds that would have dwarfed an ostrich. So with the changes to the land and the alteration in vegetation and animal life patterns, the Maori, like many other Polynesian groups, largely created the environments that they lived in.
That environment was good to the Maori, however. They grew in numbers and developed their own way of life, including special skills in carving. Many skills have been preserved and are being passed on. Women still make the traditional feather cloaks. The body of the cloak is made from flax, scraped and rolled before it's woven into different traditional patterns. Then the feathers, including those of the prized kiwi, are slowly woven in to make the finished cloak. The Maori haven't lost their original maritime skills either. They still make and use the great war canoes. This is a recent one, built up from a single giant log. These canoes hold 100 men, 70 to paddle, and 30 more who were once armed to the teeth and ready to fight.
As New Zealand's population grew, and it was more than 100,000 people by the time Tasman and Cook arrived, competition for marine resources and foods and good agricultural land increased dramatically. Just as in other places where this sort of thing happened, people became more aggressive and warlike. In the North Island especially, the Maori began to build defensive settlements called pās. These pās, they were really forts in many cases, were used to store food in winter in pits and, of course, act as retreats when communities were attacked. Some pās were built on islands or peninsulas, but any high ground could be terraced or flattened and ringed with defensive ditches and fences of sharp stakes. The best developed pās were built on extinct volcanic cones to protect the rich agricultural soil around them. And the most spectacular of these are scattered through the city of Auckland, a constant reminder to modern New Zealanders of their Polynesian past. With the settlement of New Zealand, the Polynesian Triangle was complete, a colossal achievement of discovery and migration, and an indication of the resourcefulness, the technological sophistication, and the sheer simple courage of these people. And yet the Polynesian migration is only a tiny and very recent chapter in the story of the discovery and settlement of the entire Pacific Basin. Over an enormous slice of human history, men, women and children found the margins of this great ocean and learned to live in all its parts. What a story. For me, what makes the human past, the past of all of us, so interesting and exciting is that it's full of unexpected and unimagined things. The extraordinary variation in the ways we've gone about solving problems. adapting to new and changing environments, designing tools or houses or fabrics, deciding what we'll eat. The past of the Pacific is especially interesting to me because this is where I live. And because there is something here that links the people of Tasmania all the way round and across the Pacific to Tierra del Fuego. That's half the world's population, nearly 50 nations. A very large part of what we're learning about the Pacific comes from the descendants of the original settlers of this vast area. As we've seen, right across the Pacific and round its rim, there are clear continuities of these people and their ways of living coming through from the past. In many places, the essential aspects of their traditions and cultures are not fading, but gaining strength, expanding in new ways. And that expansion is part of a new energy, the start of the Pacific century. Easter Island is an appropriate place to end this story. It was one of the very last places in the Pacific to be discovered and settled, more than 1 million years after human beings looked out on this ocean for the very first time. Over that enormous period, all sorts of people moved across it under many different sails, an unbroken wave of evolution and expansion that was only interrupted when over the horizon came a new people under a very different kind of sail.